This is the tape lithography portion of Dr. Pfister's laboratory protocol for Campenot chambers. So we start off with our glass slide. And first you're going to want to clean the glass slide by pulling off any particulate matter using a piece of tape. You should have tape anyway, since this is going to be a necessary component in the protocol. And just tear it off, attach it to both sides. And this is just getting any of the dust off. And you're going to want to do that 2 times. After you're done, give it a very quick wipe with some ethanol. And before you do the actual tape lithography taping, just make sure this ethanol is actually all dried off, since the tape won't adhere if there's any ethanol on the slide. Right. Now we're going to attach our tape, and you really want to make sure there's no air bubbles in it. So for that process, I like to use a plastic card of any kind, just anything that can give you a straight edge. And then you want to sort of just lay the tape down and work it forward. And then you want to check for any air bubbles. It looks like I got a few in there, so I'm going to have to redo this. But that is the process. And if you only have a couple, you can actually just use the corner to work them out. But I will, as I said, have to redo this one. But if I didn't, let's say that there's no tape, any bubbles in the tape, then you can start to cut your slide out of the tape. Once your slide has been removed and is air bubble free, then it's ready for the actual cutting of the tape to create your channels. So you can either use a cry cut machine or really anything that will get your precise cuts. You can also do it manually, reusing that straight edge to get the straight cuts. So I'll do an example cut now. The disadvantage of doing it manually is you don't really have any tolerance for how precise you can be with your channels. But if, for example, this is roughly what I wanted for my channel to look like, I can now peel off the tape from the other sides. And usually with these, you're going to want to make as many channels as you can just for the axons to go through. But as with anything, it depends on the purpose of your Campenot chambers or your micro channels. There we go, and just got to do the other side. Now that we've performed the tape lithography portion of our protocol, we can start preparing our silicone to create our microchannels. So we're going to be using Siligard, silicone base, and curing agent. Typically these are used in a 1:10 dilution ratio. Instead of 1:10, we're going to be using more like 0.9 to 10, That's because we want our silicone to stay kind of sticky so it better adheres to the wells we're going to be placing it in later. So now that we've poured both the base and curing agent in together, we have to mix them. And you want to be pretty thorough with this. You'll notice that as you mix, you're introducing a lot of air bubbles, which is what we're going to be dealing with next when we suck those out in the vacuum chamber. You're going to want to make sure that you use a plastic utensil for whenever you are mixing this. So now that we've mixed it, we're going to pour it into the 100 millimeter by 15 millimeter plastic well that I've placed the tape lithography slide in. And you can just pour it directly on top. And you really just want just enough so that it's submerged, and so that whenever the silicone cures, it's going to be thick enough that it's not just tearing apart on you. All right, now it's ready for the vacuum chamber. So this is the vacuum chamber that we're going to be using. We've actually just got a sealable lid here and a vacuum pump. You may be using a vacuum chamber that's electronic where you can actually adjust parameters. In our case, we're going to be going by eye through the hole here. So you want to make sure that the outlet valve is closed so that you're actually pumping air out, not running it back in, and then you can turn on your motor. Pumping out the air has created a low pressure environment inside the vacuum chamber, which has helped draw out any air pockets that may have been in our silicone. They tend to rest at the surface for a while, but sometimes opening the outlet valve is enough to pop them. And very often it will take multiple tries, so we're going to do this again. So now that our silicone has been properly prepared, you're going to want to transport it to the nearest oven. Try to be careful not to perturb it too much because you may introduce more air bubbles. And you're going to want to preheat the oven to 40 degrees Celsius. Now, a lot of the instructions for curing silicone recommend 45 minutes at 100 degrees Celsius. Because I'm using a plastic well plate, that will be too hot and will actually melt my plate. So instead, I'm going to be doing approximately 3 hours at 40 degrees Celsius. Now that just happens to be enough for the amount of silicone I tend to pour. Depending on your application, it may take a different amount of time to cure. But whatever amount of time to cure is right for your silicone, just make sure that it's cured all the way. Because if it is not completely cured, when you try to peel out your silicone, it may tear or it may disrupt your channels. Once your silicone has been cured properly, you're going to have to remove it from the dish. Very often the dish will break in the removal process, but I like to try to remove this in one piece without breaking the dish. So the way you do that is you work a scalpel in and then at an angle start to work it out of the dish. As you do this, you'll start to separate the silicone from the wall, and you want to work your way under and peel it right off. Now, very often the slide will come out of your dish along with your silicone, and that's okay. It just means you have to cut that out as well. Being careful not to cut or obstruct your channels in any way. You can actually see the channels that have been inlaid by the tape there. I do like to actually store it back in its original plate just to avoid any dust or particulate matter getting into the channels. But I also recommend cleaning off the silicone before using it for whatever your application may be. So now we're going to want to cut out the channel portion from our silicone. Try to maintain a consistent pressure as we want a smooth slice. And it may actually take a few separate scorings in order to actually completely separate the silicone. I'm not being as careful towards this lower end just because there aren't any channels over here, so you don't really need to worry unless there's channels around. And you're actually going to want to check to make sure that you have more or less smooth surface where your channels are. And you can actually see there's some lack of smoothness here, so you're going to want to take the edge of the blade and just smooth that out a little bit. And another thing is sometimes your tape actually didn't go all the way to the edge of the slide. It may have peeled during really any part of the process. So I've actually just noticed that with a few of these channels here, they don't go to the edge. So when I'm starting to cut the different sections that I'm going to put in my well plate, I'm just going to want to make sure that there's open ends of the channel on both parts. So now I'm going to actually be slicing out portions of these channels to place in my 12 well plate. This isn't going to be the final 12 well plate I'm using, since the plate does need to be sterile. You're going to want to keep it sealed in its package and only open it inside a fume hood, and then insert these with insert your channels that we'll be cutting with sterilized forceps after you've autoclaved the portions of the channel. But for now, I recommend sacrificing at least one of your sterile 12 well plates in order to size out your channels correctly. So we're going to be using the lid to actually get a good idea of how long our channels should be, and then taking cuts accordingly. So I'm going to be cutting right about here. I don't really want to cut on top of plastic because that doesn't always go so well, so I'm just marking out where I want to cut, and then I'll cut all the way through. And there we are. And then we're just going to want to check to make sure that it'll fit correctly. Yeah. So as you can see, it looks like we've cut it just a little too big. So you're going to want just a little bit more tolerance on there. And you want it to squish in there a little bit just so it has a tight seal at the edges. So that looks pretty good. And you're just going to want to do that for each well that you want to have.